This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, the murderous rampage of the Israeli military and government continues unabated. We have a lot of breaking news to cover today, including the killing of an American citizen by the Israeli army in the West Bank, the killing of 61 more Palestinian civilians in Gaza when an Israeli rocket fired into a civilian camp, essentially within a schoolyard, killing 61 Palestinian civilians. And then in some breaking news that we'll cover just briefly today, there was an attack on the Israeli military outpost border crossing with Jordan within the last couple of hours, and 3 Israeli military personnel were killed this morning. So the situation is escalating. There have been further attacks on a regular basis, and the situation, despite what we hear from President Biden of a ceasefire being imminent, it's nowhere close. But before we get to those stories, Jamal, we're going to watch a really great interview that you did with human rights attorney and activist Stanley Cohen, who's going to discuss how the U.S. government circumvents the Leahy Act. The Leahy Act is something we've been talking about for years, which was created to prevent the U.S. from providing military assistance to foreign forces who commit violations of human rights. And when it comes to Israel, they've gotten a pass. So Stanley Cohen will discuss that and also discuss the FARA, the Foreign Agent Re-Registration Act and Dual Loyalty Registration Act. It's a really wonderful interview.
I think it's a great interview, and it explains the Israel exemption and why literally Israel gets away with murder. Let's watch Stanley Cohen. Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank are heightening scrutiny of the United States' role and possible complicity in Israel's war crimes. Most notable is the Leahy Law, created to prevent the United States government from providing arms and military assistance to foreign military forces who commit gross violations of human rights. The Leahy Law is not being applied to Israel. In addition, Israel's military has killed multiple American citizens with impunity before and after October 7. A few days ago, an Israeli soldier shot and killed 26-year-old Aysunur Ezogi Egi, who was protesting an illegal Israeli settlement. The United States government has yet to prosecute any cases of Americans killed by Israel's military. Instead, it condones American citizens joining the IDF and fighting on behalf of Israel. As government representatives continue to prioritize Israel's interests over those of the United States in such cases, one effort to increase transparency about who we elect is the Dual Loyalty Disclosure Act, introduced by Congressman Matt Rosendale. The bill would require candidates running for office to disclose dual citizenship when filing. Here on Arab Talk this week is human rights attorney and activist Stanley Cohen. He'll discuss why Israel is consistently allowed to be the exception to U.S. law and ethical norms in the United States government. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Stanley.
Thank you. It's an honor to share some time with you as always.
Explain what the Leahy Act is and what the responsibility of the United States State Department and Department of Defense are in following it.
Well, the Leahy Act is actually a second-generation act. There was long ago, there was the Arms Export Control Act, which sets out the same purpose, which requires of a recipient nation and state to establish that they're in compliance of international and U.S. law, and they're supposed to do it with quarterly reports, but Israel is exempted from it. Israel doesn't fill out reports. So you've got the Arms Export Control Act that is much older than the Leahy Act. The Leahy Act is good. It's progressive. It says if you are getting money from the United States and you're engaged in war crimes, crimes against humanity, violations of international law, it's got to be frozen. It's got to be suspended. It's one of a number of laws, and the first one, which I litigated before, first about 25 years ago, under the Arms Export Control Act. On the other hand, Congress has the ability under both the Arms Export Control Act and the Leahy Act to cancel funding, to freeze funding, and Congress doesn't do it. And that brings us to the second point. There's actually a third point here, because when you talk about the act of the dual sovereignty or dual loyalty, there's something much more disturbing, and that's FARA, the Foreign Agent Representative Act, which requires entities, persons, individuals that are working at the behest of and on behalf of a foreign government to get a license to register full compliance so that people can determine, and not only determine what is this person doing, but it serves as the deterrence for the kind of dual loyalty or sovereignty adherence that is of concern. I'd like to know, why is it that an American citizen can go and fight in a foreign country and kill American citizens and is not registered, not required to register under FARA? They are certainly representing the interest of another country. Even if the United States says, well, it's dual interest and we're not opposed to it, it's okay. Congress has turned around and said, we want this reviewed. The real problem here is under separation of powers, it's almost impossible to enforce. But there's this lawsuit in California about 7 or 8 months ago where the court held, and it's not the first time, I litigated it 20 years ago, where the court held that separation of powers says we have to defer to the executive to do whatever they wish to do. Congress can intervene. Congress can freeze money. Congress can make a determination that there's not compliance by a recipient nation, whether it is under the Arms Export Control Act or the Leahy Act, and circumvent the political winds of the executive. But the problem is Congress has become nothing but a complete rubber stamp for AIPAC and the ADL and other Zionist organizations that have successfully, over the last 20 years in particular, insinuated themselves completely into foreign policy making more so than ever before. So when you look at AIPAC investing $10, $15, $20 million in a local congressional candidate to oppose someone whose position is clear, I'm opposed to genocide. The law requires us to monitor what's going on with our money. There needs to be a freeze under either the Arms Export Control Act or the Leahy Act. So what does AIPAC do? They throw $10 or $15 or $20 million into the opposition candidate who wins. So that's another voice that is silent. The other interesting aspect that's been totally ignored, especially now that it's spread so glaringly to the West Bank, is you have increasing numbers over the last 20 years of not-for-profit organizations, Zionist organizations, that are not being monitored, that are spending tens, perhaps hundreds of million dollars in support of settlements, money that's being used for weapons, money that's being used for so-called security. These are tax write-offs for these tax-exempt entities. Kirshner had one. The president's son-in-law is involved in one such agency, and there's been some litigation. So independent of what's going on with congressional approval for spending, with the executive discretion for arming without accountability for Israel, you have tax-exempt organizations getting the benefit of raising hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, sending them to illegal settlements in the West Bank. Every court that has examined it has found them to be illegal in violation of international law. And these are being used for what's called security purposes. But we know it's being used for purchasing of weapons. We know it's being used for expansion of quote-unquote new settlements. And that triggers what happened just 2 days ago with another American citizen executed by the Israeli army. Because Israel uses this as a pretext. Israel claims when Palestinians who are in occupied territory that are in their own homes are being forced out of their homes, their land is being stolen, their crops are being destroyed, their businesses are being shut down, that gives a pretext for Israel, and Israel really doesn't need a pretext, to increase security presence. What happens with security presence? Another person is executed. Over the last 30 days alone, over the last 60 days for sure, we've seen dozens and dozens of Palestinians in the West Bank who have been executed, including a number of Americans. We've seen almost, I think, a dozen children that have been executed. We've seen businesses destroyed. We've seen streets torn up, infrastructure decimated, the same way as in Gaza. And again, this is all with the approval, whether it's Biden, whether it's Harris, whether it's whichever congressional representative is running for office these days, it's with their support. So you have this combination of Zionist organizations insinuating themselves into the political infrastructure in this country, along with endless support by this administration and all other administrations before, and whatever Israel wants to do. Netanyahu completely manipulating, twisting, and hustling this executive, this president, this State Department. You've got this dutiful obedience to what's going on, and you've got Congress at this point that's unwilling to enforce the law. What I find interesting is this is now, there are at least, from what I could tell, a dozen American citizens, Palestinians and not Palestinians, but American citizens, who have been murdered by Israel. We know about famous journalists. We know about an elderly man who was living in his home. We know about people that were there visiting. We now know about an American who was just simply demonstrating. The Department of Justice takes it upon itself to invoke the quote-unquote new Genocide Act that's been around, relatively new, against the political leadership of Hamas, and to charge them for violation of material support of terrorism. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has done absolutely nothing to investigate, to prosecute, to impose sanctions, or to seek or to recommend them. So you have a killing field and a double standard. So while it gains political support for Biden and Harris to say, well, we've indicted the leadership of Hamas, we've done nothing when it comes to protecting Palestinian Americans and Americans that aren't Palestinian, that just happen to be visiting family or friends and exercising their right to assemble and to speak peacefully. So it is a complete distortion of getting back to the Leahy Act, what the Leahy Act was supposed to be about, what the Arms Export Control Act is supposed to be, FARA is supposed to be about, and the system of checks and balances. And Israel has just spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, along with American front organizations, to completely co-opt when it comes to Israel's benefit and will, and when it comes to the destruction of Gaza and genocide that's been ongoing for more than 75 years. Israel has, with unmatched success, been able to insinuate itself on all levels, into all standards, into all three balances of this government to accomplish what it's done while the world is crying.
Now, it's not like no one brought it up. I mean, the Leahy Act, of course, exists, but both Patrick Leahy, who created the law, as well as Charles Blaha, who for 7 years until 2023 was the director of the State Department office that leads Leahy vetting of foreign security units, have written clear and forceful opinion pieces stating that the law should be applied to Israel, yet is not. They both give specific examples of Israel's grave human rights violations. So I don't understand, how does the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, avoid applying the Leahy Act to Israel when he himself has already acknowledged it has committed multiple egregious human rights violations?
Well, again, it's the same responses that I have when I raise the issue of the Arms Export Control Act. Congress spoke, but laws must be enforced by the executive branch. So if the president ignores it, it doesn't matter what Blinken says or does. The reality of it is, until the president of the United States orders the executive branch to enforce the Leahy Act, there's nothing that can be done except for Congress, which can freeze funding. So you've got this merger of executive branch rubber stamp for Israeli policies, and you've got, along with congressional silence, indifference, and political appetite for themselves and their own future. So what you've got is applause for Leahy and applause for those few representatives in the State Department, some who have resigned and some who have written powerful opinion pieces. But unless and until the president does something, unless and until the president puts words into action, it's just feel good. It's like chanting and lighting candles. It's used for political leverage and political mileage. And then ultimately, the ultimate check on what the law is and is not, if it's constitutional or not, are the courts. And the courts, not only are they rubber stamps for the executive branch generally, with what happened with Trump and also with Biden, with just stacking the courts with their own political appointees, but the notion of separation of powers, which says the court, when it comes to foreign affairs, cannot tell the executive branch what to do. Congress can, but Congress is more concerned about winning re-election every 2 years and the need for money. So my hat goes off to Leahy. My hat goes off to other representatives that have, with powerful written pieces and public statements, alerted and spoken directly to the point of what's clearly Israeli genocide. You've got preliminary findings of genocide by the ICJ. You've got an application for arrest warrants at the ICC. You've got United Nations findings that everybody that's looked at it that talks about Israeli crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. But yet until Biden or Harris or whomever should take office decides to do something, nothing can be done. The reality of it is, I have been saying, especially for the last 11 months now, Biden could end this in 1 minute. Biden does not have to beg Netanyahu for a ceasefire. Biden does not have to beg Netanyahu to pull back. Biden does not have to say to the West Bank, the occupation, please be kind and apply law. Biden can simply pick up a phone, as interestingly enough, George Bush did during the so-called first Gulf War, when he told, at that point, I think it was Perez, I'm not sure, he told him, if you fire rockets back at Iraq at that time, I'm going to rip up a check, and that's the end of it, and Israel didn't do it. So Biden, with one phone call, can tell Netanyahu, this is done. If you don't stop fighting, if you don't stop dropping bombs, if you don't start encroaching and stealing more territory, you're not getting any money, end of story. And it's over tomorrow. But Biden won't do it. Harris is not going to be any different. Yes, we hear things like treat Palestinians with dignity and respect. Palestinians don't need dignity and respect. They need their lives. They need their children. They need the protection from a genocide. That's what they need. And that's what they're entitled to under international law and under U.S. law. And the rest of it is a political facade where everyone, once in a while, Biden will say, I'm outraged. And notice, every time Biden or Blinken makes an announcement, we have a deal, Netanyahu says, no, we don't. And just changes the terms and conditions. And then screams at Hamas, it's Hamas, it's Hamas, it's jihad. So if there's ever been an example of the insinuation of a foreign entity and its agents into the American political process, it is now, it is Israel, it is AIPAC, it is the ADL. And it's spreading domestically with repression on college campuses, with penalizing people for protesting. So they've done it. And as long as the executive is willing to allow them to get away with it, it's going to continue. And we don't need more nice talk, good words, let's sit down. We now have the vice presidential candidate saying Israel needs to start thinking about a two-state solution. Really? Where have I heard that before the last 75, 79 years? What two-state solution is left? The United States continues to provide money while Israel steals more and more land, while the Israeli military infrastructure in the West Bank. When Netanyahu stands up on a map and says, yes, from the river, from the sea, Zionist, and shows a map where all Palestine is erased. So it's this duplicity, this double standard, and this failure of the executive branch or Congress or the courts to intervene. And ultimately, it's up to people on the streets in the United States as it is worldwide.
You mentioned the deaths of several American citizens by Israel, of course, the latest of which is a 26-year-old Aisanur Egi. And there is a long list which includes Rachel Corey and award-winning journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and they've gotten nothing. And this is a very the United States it's a very litigious society, right? So if someone gets hit by a car, there is a lawsuit, and the victim or the victim's family is compensated. But you got in these cases, we haven't heard any compensation, any justice. So what can the victims' families do if their own government is not doing anything on their behalf?
Let me give you the perfect example of duplicity. The department, there's this notion of extraterritoriality, which on the one hand, the Department of Justice says we're only able to enforce U.S. federal law on statutes where Congress oversees, where Congress has given us the grant of authority to do so. And then we're free to pursue them. And for years, it was limited to injuries, loss of life, or harm to federal officials or subcontractors for the United States. Being kidnapped, being shot, there's extraterritoriality. I find it interesting that the United States can kidnap and rendition hundreds, if not thousands, of largely Arab defendants, ignoring the notion of territoriality and simply saying, we're going to take you and we're going to bring you to the United States for allegations pertaining to conduct overseas that may have or may not have had an impact on American citizens in general. So there is, again, an example of DOJ has done nothing. And what's also interesting is the double standard is that there's been at least a dozen lawsuits brought by Israelis against Abu Omar, against Hamas, against Jihad, against individuals in the United States, in which there have been summary judgments and renditions for billions of dollars for conduct and acts attributed to the defendants in Palestine that have nothing to do with the jurisdiction of the United States at all. But yet the courts have accepted it, and there have been these sham trials, these mock trials, and there are these judgments hanging over the head. So the question that you really phrased is a question that I've raised on numerous occasions. If I'm the parent of an American citizen, if I'm Rachel Corey's family, and my child is not in violation of any law, and they're in a country lawfully as she was in Palestine, and she gets murdered by an Israeli soldier, what is it that prevents me from suing those soldiers, their superiors, and that state in an American court? Now, Israel says you have no jurisdiction. There's qualified immunity, the sovereign immunity. You have to go through an Israeli court to get justice. You have the doctrine of futility, which says you don't have to exhaust administrative remedies when you can establish either a judicial system is dilatory, is incompetent, is politically implicated or affected, or corrupt. That's a working definition for Israel, its judicial system. Plus, you have the problem for Palestinians on the ground, that if you're in the occupied territories where millions of Palestinians reside, you're denied equal access to the Israeli justice system. Forget about the criminal system, the civil system. If my next-door neighbor in an illegal settlement has a claim and they're an occupier, they can bring an action against me, my family, my community in an Israeli civil court. If my outpost, my home, my fields are destroyed, I can't do the same. So you're absolutely right. And again, it seems to me the remedy is to come to grips with the reality that the system is broken, that it doesn't work to protect the interest, whether it's in court or extrajudicial, out of court, when it comes to Palestine in particular. And the remedy there is political pressure. The remedy is and this is what is of concern in America right now, is pressure in the streets, is pressure on congressional representatives. It's what happened where in Michigan, where 12, 13, 14% of the people said we're not voting for Biden. That's the political mechanism. Until such time as you have executives and congressional representatives that are willing to require Israel to comply, until such time as you have compliance with FARA, until you have such time as there is an investigation, a serious investigation on just how AIPAC, we've talked about the NRA for years, insinuating itself into the political process in the United States. They're rank amateurs compared to AIPAC. AIPAC has gotten 100% of everything they want at all times in this country, and there's no FARA requirement for that. Who better than AIPAC acting as a foreign agent for Israel? And then you've got the tax-exempt organizations that continue to get tax-exempt status, and they take hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars. They send them to the West Bank for whatever purpose they wish to use. Where's the accountability? There have been actions. There are a couple of lawsuits which were brought by families of Palestinians that lost their lives, their homes, their property in Palestine, in federal courts in the United States, specifically around this issue, that have languished for any number of reasons. And ultimately, one major problem we're going to have is with this particular Supreme Court in particular, and with most of the circuits now, so conservative and so committed to becoming involved in the politics of an issue, the remedies that are, as you point out, available to other people for a car accident are not available to me if I lose whether I'm an American or a Palestinian American, whether I lose one child, 6 child, my business, my family, my community, my home. Americans can travel to Italy and get protection. Americans can travel to France and get protection. Americans can have business in the UK and get protection. But if you're Palestinian, if you're an Arab in general, if you're Palestinian in particular, you get none in the United States process. That's the cold, hard reality. Now, that doesn't mean people shouldn't pursue remedies. It doesn't mean people should surrender. It means there's a long process. I hate to say it, but I've been saying it for 30 years. It's a marathon and not a sprint. We have to bring all the pressures we can bring in court and out of court to deal with these issues.
In addition to this, significant numbers of American citizens have gone to fight with the Israeli military in Gaza, possibly committing war crimes, then returning to the United States. What is the U.S. government's policy on citizens serving in another country's military, especially one which international courts are investigating for genocide and war crimes?
Well, we've yet to see it, but there are a number of American soldiers or American citizens, young women and men, that have gone to Israel that are now, there are claims they were involved in genocide actively. It's not just, we're not talking about, if I'm an American citizen and I go to the fight with the Israeli army, being able to with the occupation forces, to raise a claim, you went and that's enough. There are cases now where American citizens have gone to join the IOF, have gone to settlements in the West Bank, and have been involved in war crimes, have been involved in genocide. We know recently the United States has begun to freeze the economic, the bank accounts and investment accounts of a number of settlers, so-called settlers. Some involved are Americans. You're absolutely right. I want to know why someone who claims dual citizenship, but is an American citizen, can go overseas and fight with another country. Keep in mind that when American citizens went to fight against the fascists in Spain during the 50s, there was a big uproar in Congress. It basically was part of the trigger with UAC, the investigation. Why are American citizens going to fight in Spain? Well, why are American citizens going to murder people in Gaza? Why are American citizens going over to destroy Palestinian villages in the occupied territory? The remedy, if possible, and it's interesting because you don't get qualified immunity or immunity by virtue of joining another army. We're not talking about an American soldier involved overseas. Keep in mind, while prosecutions are few and far between, and litigation is far and few between, there have been cases where American soldiers have been prosecuted for war crimes while serving overseas. Typically, they are erased, the cases. Typically, they go away, but at least there's an effort at accountability. We are talking about, and you raise a very clear example of it, what are we going to do now with increasing evidence that a certain U.S. citizen, be they a man or a woman, goes to Israel, joins the IOF, commits genocide in Gaza, goes to the West Bank and is involved in violations of international law as an illegal occupier. And the hope is that as more evidence develops, that actions can be brought against them. They don't have immunity in U.S. courts. The U.S. can't intervene because it's not a case of a U.S. soldier being sent somewhere. This is someone who chooses to go overseas and commit war crimes. It'll be interesting as these cases evolve and unfold, and I believe they will. I know there are active investigations at a number. But I'd like to point out that one of the biggest problems in Columbia University last year during the demonstrations, and including with a client of mine I represented, who was gassed with some sort of noxious substance and has realized some very serious ongoing health problems. There's an investigation that's been stalled by the Manhattan District Attorney with the allegations that the people that did this were Israeli students that came to Columbia University and had been members of the IOF or were in the reserves, and nothing has happened so far. So again, for years I have debated with people and taken the position, no, the United States is not owned or controlled by Israel. Israel is a proxy, a dutiful proxy, and there's an engagement that says we will do for you as long as you do for us. But it's become so obvious the last 11 months that United States indifference to international law, to U.S. law, to domestic requirements, says that Israel and its representatives, whether it be AIPAC, whether it be the ADL, whether it be Zionist organizations, have so deeply insinuated themselves into our domestic practices, policies, and branches of government as to be in the driver's seat at this point when it comes to what's going on. The outrage that the United States has sat back while U.S. money, U.S. bombs, U.S. weapons have committed per capita the most egregious genocide, the most egregious loss of civilian life since Dresden in World War II, since Hiroshima, since Nagasaki, and the United States is silent.
It will be very interesting if, and I'm sure some of these cases are documented, if an American citizen goes and fights in the Israeli military and brutalizes or murders a Palestinian American there. What recourse then would that Palestinian American would have right here in the United States when the American soldier returns here?
Clearly has standing to bring a lawsuit. More important than the lawsuit at this point is, the Department of Justice with regularity is asked by families to investigate matters. And it does. And at times it indicts. So under your, I don't think hypothetical, under the reality of what you just said, pressure should be put upon the Department of Justice to investigate. There's the MLAT treaty we have with Israel, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, which requires the Israeli government, under the treaty, as it does the United States, to provide information during investigations, to be of assistance, to turn over reports and records and notes, to give anything that they know about a particular person or a case to the Department of Justice. It's a treaty. Israel generally ignores it. At best, it drags its feet. I've been involved in cases where MLAT Accord requests have gone unanswered for years, especially when you're dealing with what I call the Brooklyn Kahanists. The real fascist, right-wing, conservative control of the Israeli government is not just Ashkenazi Jews from Poland. Is this offshoot of the Kahanist movement in the United States, the next generation from Brooklyn, from the United States, that have gone to Israel, that have gone to occupied Palestine, that have political power right now. These are American citizens. The fact that they are living in Israel and claiming dual citizenship should deny, and the fact they may be members of the Knesset doesn't grant them any sort of protection in the United States. I mean, if the United States can bring actions against Putin, if the United States can bring actions against members of the Russian military and political mechanism, but can't against Israel? But it's not just the United States. The perfect example is the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Putin within 15 days of the request. And here we are 6 months after the request, or 5 months, and it's still dragging. So again, it goes back to, at what point does the world decide Israel not just has to be held accountable, but recognize that Israel is in this very special separate class of state and people from the rest of the world entirely. There is a double standard in every phase when it comes to Israel. Israel no longer even has to do this under cover of darkness. They have come to the point in its history of genocide, of land theft, of crimes against humanity, of ethnic cleansing, of war crimes. No one even bothers to talk about apartheid. Apartheid's the least of the problem. I mean, when you talk about what's going on in the West Bank right now, where dozens of tractors, Israeli tractors, show up, rip apart a town, destroy all the roads, destroy the schools, rip apart the infrastructure. What is this? It's become so regular and so insinuated into the body politic of this country that it creates a problem. And you're absolutely right. For those people who have been murdered, for those Palestinian Americans who have been murdered or crippled or had their homes destroyed, their lives, their businesses destroyed by an American who went to Israel to join the occupation forces and engaged in it, they should bring actions in the United States court. Let's see what U.S. judges and the U.S. justice system says to them.
When the United States support for a foreign country supersedes its duty to protect the physical and constitutional rights of its own citizens, people want transparency about where that influence stems from. Last year, Congressman Matt Rosendale proposed the Dual Loyalty Disclosure Act. This legislation would amend the Federal Election Campaign Act to require the disclosure of dual citizenship when candidates file to run for office. This has recently been brought up by Congressman Massey during an interview, and he's been posting about it, that why dual citizens, be it Israeli, Americans with Israeli citizenship, or with Canadian citizenship, or with Irish citizenship, why shouldn't they disclose that they have, number one, a dual citizenship, and two, be dismissed from serving, let's say, on issues that affect that country, and this is being brought up, but it's kind of not moving anywhere.
No,
I mean, isn't this a common sense bill?
Well, yeah. Ascribing common sense to Congress is a dream beyond reality. There are constitutional edicts. I don't expect Congress, as an entity, to pass a law, to be able to get enough votes through. And I don't expect the president to permit or sign it. I would expect its veto. I think the real answer is on a grassroots level. It's making sure that people in the community, whether it's Israel, whether it's Spain, whether it's Italy, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Russia, whomever it may be. And, the interesting thing is right now, the current governor of New York and the previous governor of New York, people that worked for them both for years have just been charged with crimes for being a front for China. Okay, for 3 years, made millions of dollars. We also know there's a big deal right now where the Department of Justice has just indicted people, Russians, for insinuating themselves against the process. So this is and they're fugitives, and there's an outlet that's being shut down right now in the Midwest that the Department of Justice has evidence they believe, or they've shown to a grand jury, that this vehicle has served as a mouthpiece for Russia. You hit it on the head. And again, I get treated very differently. I don't expect a bill to be passed and signed by a president which says dual loyalties have to be raised. The law that exists is FARA. The Hatch Act prevents an American representative of the government, even the president, to speak about political campaigns or to walk outside of their political responsibilities. And people can be prosecuted, can be fined, can lose their jobs. And there are ethical requirements among congressional representatives. There's a committee that oversees it. And there have been congressional representatives who have lost their positions because of it. So while the effort is underway to require people to be candid about citizenship, etc., not just citizenship, loyalty, there are in place vehicles to hold people accountable. And the only way those vehicles become real is if local communities demand it. If local communities demand of their congressional representatives and let them know. If AIPAC can turn around and spend $15 million or $20 million to get a congressional representative removed, it requires a grassroots response to make sure that the local communities understand the full implications. There are all sorts of options and opportunities on the table in theory in a tripartite system of government that would endure to the benefit of all Americans, no matter what their background, their faith, their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, their color. They're there. But until we begin to galvanize, and I've been saying this for decades, until we begin to organize as a community to put pressure on the political actors in our society, it remains just beyond the reach of reality. What's really disturbing to me is not before has it become so crystal clear that Israel has insinuated itself into all aspects of the American body politic. Not before has the genocide been so clear. Not before has the indifference of the executive, the congressional, and the judiciary in a different respect become so clear, and yet there's silence. What happens? Biden will make a speech. Harris will make a speech. Her vice presidential candidate will start talking about a two-state solution. That train left a long time ago. So the answer is yes, attempts at lawsuits. More important, the answer is local organizing, demonstrations, pushing the envelope, confronting the beast, and forcing people to make hard decisions as Americans, not as surrogates, whether it's for Israel or Russia or Ukraine or China or any other country. What is also so very interesting is at the same time we are debating what a democracy is about. And at the same time, there's this clash among candidates running for president about what is entitled by a democracy. The very essence of a democracy is being stripped from us publicly. There are millions of Arab, Muslim, many millions, and Palestinian American citizens, family members, businesses that are being completely ignored, once again being singled out, losing their lives, being isolated against the chant now of this distortion of, quote, anti-Semitism is nonsense. It's rubbish. If we challenge Israel, we hate Jews. If we stand and demand that U.S. laws be applied, we're anti-Semitic. It's this distortion. But again, I go back to these entities that until the government starts requiring groups like AIPAC to register as FARA and to comply with FARA and to be candid, keep in mind, FARA is already in place and could accomplish what some congressional representatives have been talking about in terms of the requirement of being public about who you're working with or for. FARA could do that just the way the Arms Export Control Act and the Leahy Act can act. The vehicles are there. What is not there is the independence of our own congressional and executive branch. I mean, Blinken, the perfect example. Blinken is a proud Zionist from Westchester. I was born in Westchester. I know the community where he comes from. He makes his press conferences. He makes his speech. Biden says he's outraged. Biden suspends 2 cents on a dollar for a week. Biden turns around and gives Israel 2,000 new bombs to use. Biden turns around and gives Israel an emergency grant of $1 billion and then says, okay, we're going to build a pier. So we're going to destroy your home. We're going to destroy your hospitals. We're going to destroy your schools. We're going to allow your citizens, including Americans, to be executed. And then maybe we can beg Israel to allow some water in. So it's this duplicity where the political leadership tries to get the best of all worlds. It tries to keep in order, in a row, its dutiful obedience these days, certainly to the Israeli and Zionist narrative, but yet turn around and try to portray we're concerned. Every day you hear something out of the Harris campaign about it's got to stop. It's got to stop. It's genocide. It's acting. It's on war crimes. All the little language. Let's have a ceasefire. Whatever happened to that Security Council that the United States didn't veto finally, demanding a ceasefire? Nothing happened. There's actions that can be taken. It's all about generating the politics. And I've got to tell you, with 60 days to go in the election, don't expect any change. Because Biden and Harris and her crew are playing to the Zionist wing completely. You've got Trump playing to the Zionist wing completely. And those people that are up there saying, not in my name, including tens, hundreds of thousands, especially of young Jews in the streets, they get pushed aside.
Last question. With both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court already determining Israel is probably, committing genocide and war crimes, and will the full military and financial support by the U.S. government mean some officials, or some U.S. officials, might ultimately be found complicit?
No, there's no jurisdiction. I don't expect that. But what I do expect, if I represent tax-exempt organizations that are giving billions of dollars to settlements, so-called settlements, to settlers entities, and if an arrest warrant is issued for Netanyahu or other Israeli leaders, the first thing I do is I pick up the phone, call my client, and say, stop. You are now specifically on notice. It's not just the ICJ suggesting there appears to be a probable cause or prima facie case of genocide. If arrest warrants are actually issued for war crimes, crimes against humanity, against the individual leadership of Israel, it now puts specifically on notice these private actors that are smuggling billions of dollars to Israel. Because the United States is not a signatory to the ICC, it's unenforceable. Because the ICJ has no mechanism whatsoever, unless it's the United Nations, and the Security Council has ultimate control over this, little that can be done. But with a finding by the ICC of arrest warrants, individuals, not state actors, private entities, tax-exempt organizations that continue to raise money, to send it. They are now on notice that your money is going to someone who is wanted for war crimes, someone who an arrest warrant has been issued for. You are very much subject to charges yourself because you are funding, you are supporting, you are involved in a conspiracy after the fact, which you now are on notice. Right now, I can say, I don't know. I assume the money we're raising and using is going for health care, education, perfectly lawful ideas. You know, there's another double standard that's interesting. There have been dozens of people that have been prosecuted and gone to prison in the United States under material support for terrorism, and that have done nothing more than raise money for goods and services for the homeless, for refugee camps, for people in need, for education programs. And the theory under the humanitarian law project is if you raise money for social service, if you raise money for education, if you raise money for refugee camps, what we consider to be terrorist organizations that normally would be responsible for paying those funds don't have to pay those funds and can use their money not for the necessity of social services, but for weapons and to engage in jihad. That's what the theory is. So my position is this. What's the difference between Americans that raise money and send it to settlements that are in violation of international law, which frees Israel up for using money that they would otherwise, quote unquote, be obligated to provide, to use for the slaughter of Palestinians? There's no difference. There's a double standard in application of law. There are people in prison in the United States who have been found guilty of material support of terrorism for doing nothing more than raising $35,000 in money that was sent to a refugee camp where this woman came from to assist family and friends in the community. There are people that have done 30 years in prison for raising money for social service programs in an area that was, quote unquote, controlled by Hezbollah. So if I'm an American and I'm raising money for groups and organizations that are involved in genocide, if I'm an American raising money for individuals who have now been found that they're on the list and are suspended from aid, why am I not equally culpable for material support? It's the double standard again.
Stanley Cohen, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure as always, my friend. Be well.
Well, that's the voice in the face of Stanley Cohen, human rights activists, discussing how Israel gets away literally with murder. You know, Jamal, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for decades, Stanley Cohen breaks it down into detail, which is, important for all of us to see. The Leahy Act, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the Dual Loyalty Registration Act. These are all, codified laws which prevent the U.S. government from sending military weapons to foreign governments and armies that commit illegal acts and war crimes. But Israel gets a pass.
And the latest of which, as you've mentioned, Jess, is the killing of Aisanur Ezgi Egi, who was killed just a few days ago by an Israeli soldier. And what we heard from the State Department and the National Security Advisor, spokesman, and so forth is basically that they are disturbed by the tragic death of an American citizen, and that they've reached out to the Israeli government and asked them for more information. So they're not making any judgment. They're waiting for Israel basically to investigate itself. Let's compare that quickly with the killing of Israeli American hostage Hirsch Goldberg. President Biden issued an immediate statement saying, "Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes." Did we hear him say, "Make no mistake, Netanyahu will pay for these crimes," or the Israeli leaders will pay for these crimes?
No, Jamal, we haven't, and we won't hear. This is part of the racist asymmetry in U.S. foreign policy that, as we said before, gives the Israeli government a pass when they kill American citizens. And there has been settler violence in Jenin and throughout the West Bank causing millions of dollars. American citizens are routinely killed, not only by the Israeli military, but Israeli settlers. And all we hear is this weak not even condemnation, the weak statements coming from Biden and Sullivan and Blinken, all saying, well, we want to get information. Well, what do you think the Israeli government's going to do with their investigation? They're going to say nothing. Let's remember that this American citizen, this young woman, was sniped at, Jamal. She just wasn't killed. She was shot in the head. This was a bullet to the head. This was not a random attack. This was a targeted assassination against an American citizen. And we've heard nothing from the White House or the State Department condemning this vicious act of violence against an American citizen.
Well, there is a precedent, and we know the precedent. Did anything happen when Israel murdered journalist Shireen Abu Akleh? Nothing. Anything happened?
Or Rachel Corrie?
Anything happened exactly when they killed Richard Corey? Again, nothing. Recently, in April, people might have forgotten that Israel carried out 3 separate attacks on a convoy aid of workers who had informed the Israeli military about their movements and got their approval, and killed a U.S.-Canadian dual national in the process.
Right.
We didn't hear anything from either the United States or Canada. It was a big story because, they have attacked, that convoy. And then I think people had forgotten about it. Omar Asad, an 80-year-old Palestinian man, was zip-tied, made to kneel face down on the cold pavement. He's 80-year-old, and died. And the Israeli soldiers watched him, didn't offer any treatment, didn't call an ambulance for him. Again, just like condemnation by Secretary Blinken, no repercussion of whatsoever.
None.
And we can go on and on and on and name these Americans all the way back, to the attack on the Liberty, USS Liberty, that actually there is a yearly commemoration of that from its survivors. And Israel gets away with murder. That's the bottom line. But Stanley Cohen talked about the Leahy Act and actually other laws that prevented, not to mention international laws. They apply to everyone except for Israel.
Well, this is the story that we've been talking about for decades, Jamal. I just want to point out a few things. Many of the settlers, at least 25 to 30% of the illegal colonial settlers who commit violence against Palestinian civilians, some of whom are American citizens. These Israeli settlers, at least 25 to 30%, are also American citizens committing acts of violence internationally who get a pass. Many people who serve in the Israeli military are also dual citizens, American and Israeli dual citizenship, who get away with serving in the army of a foreign country and committing acts of violence, also at times against American citizens. So the hypocrisy and the double standard and the gross violations of international law, as Stanley Cohen pointed out, are like striking us in the face, are hitting us in the face. And yet the murderous rampage in Gaza continues, Jamal. Those 61 souls who were murdered by the Israeli military in the last few days in Gaza, they fired U.S.-made rockets into a schoolyard again. So one final question, because I know we have to run. This sounds like a Biden ceasefire where Israel gets to do whatever it wants to do and kill civilians, and Biden says we're close to a ceasefire. It's laughable, Jamal.
It is laughable. I mean, I can talk and we can spend hours on this. And the question is, what Israel hasn't violated, basically, as far as international laws, U.S. laws, when it comes to attacking hospitals, schools, refugee camps, and so on, aid workers, convoys. I mean, every day is a violation. Every day we see children in hospitals, dead or with lost limbs and so on. Anyway, you've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.